In a forgotten valley deep within the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings to ancient trees and silence stretches for miles, researchers discovered something that would haunt them forever. The Hartwell family had lived in complete isolation for over a century, hidden from the outside world by choice and circumstance. When authorities finally reached their remote homestead, they found children whose pale eyes reflected an otherworldly intelligence, whose movements carried an unsettling grace that seemed almost inhuman. The family's bloodline had remained pure through generations of intermarriage between brothers and sisters, creating offspring that medical science struggled to categorize. Their elongated limbs, translucent skin, and ability to communicate without words challenged everything doctors thought they knew about human genetics and development. What happens when humanity evolves in complete isolation for 5 generations? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung thick over Blackwood Valley when Ranger Jake Morrison first spotted the smoke rising from between the ancient pines. In his 15 years patrolling these remote sections of the Appalachian wilderness, he had never seen signs of habitation this deep in the mountains. The nearest marked trail lay 12 miles behind him, and no permits had been issued for camping in this restricted area. Morrison adjusted his pack and pushed through the dense undergrowth, following a path so faint it might have been carved by deer rather than human feet. The air grew heavier as he descended into the valley, carrying scents he couldn't identify, something between wood smoke and decay, tinged with an herbal sweetness that made his stomach turn. The first structure he encountered was a crude fence made from split logs and rusted wire, standing barely 4 feet high, but stretching as far as he could see in either direction. Beyond it lay a clearing that seemed carved from another century. A weathered log cabin sat at the center, its chimney releasing the thin column of smoke that had drawn him here. Smaller buildings dotted the perimeter, a barn, what appeared to be a smokehouse, and several structures he couldn't immediately identify. Morrison called out a greeting, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed valley. No response came from the buildings, but he sensed movement in his peripheral vision. Turning, he found himself face to face with a child unlike any he had ever seen. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but his proportions seemed wrong. His limbs stretched too long for his torso, giving him an almost spider-like appearance. His skin held an alabaster quality, so pale Morrison could see the blue network of veins beneath the surface. Most disturbing were the eyes, enormous and colorless like pools of mercury reflecting the filtered sunlight. "Hello there," Morrison said gently, dropping to one knee to appear less threatening. The child tilted his head at an angle that seemed anatomically impossible, studying Morrison with an intensity that made the ranger's skin crawl. More children emerged from behind the buildings, 5 in total, all sharing the same unsettling characteristics. They moved in perfect synchronization, as if responding to signals Morrison couldn't perceive. None of them spoke, but their pale eyes tracked his every movement with predatory focus. A door creaked open on the main cabin, and an adult figure stepped onto the sagging porch. The man appeared to be in his 50s, though his features held the same elongated quality as the children. His hair, white as snow despite his apparent age, hung past his shoulders in tangled strands. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice carrying an accent Morrison couldn't place, something archaic, as if English were a language he had learned from books rather than conversation. "I'm Jake Morrison, park ranger. I saw smoke and came to investigate. This is restricted federal land." The man's laugh held no humor. "Federal land? Yes, I suppose it is now. We were here before your government drew its lines on maps." Morrison noticed a woman watching from the cabin's single window, her face a pale blur in the shadows. 2 more adult figures stood near the barn, their postures suggesting they were ready to flee or fight, depending on his next move. "How long have you folks been living here?" Morrison asked, trying to maintain a casual tone while his mind raced through protocols for dealing with squatters in protected wilderness areas. "Time moves differently in the valley," the man replied. "Days blend into seasons, seasons into years. We measure our existence by births and deaths, not by the calendar of the outside world." One of the children approached Morrison, moving with that same unsettling grace. The boy held something in his small hands, a wooden cross carved with symbols that didn't match any religious tradition Morrison recognized. The markings seemed to shift in the changing light, creating the illusion of movement across the wood's surface. Morrison accepted the cross, noting how cold it felt despite being warmed by the child's grip. The symbols appeared to be burned into the wood rather than carved, creating deep grooves that felt smooth beneath his fingers. "That's beautiful craftsmanship," Morrison said. Though the object made him profoundly uncomfortable, the man on the porch stepped forward. "We are the Hartwell family. This valley has been our home since before your great-grandfather drew his first breath. We ask only to be left in peace." Morrison found himself nodding, though every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this isolated family. The children's silence, their synchronized movements, the adults' archaic speech patterns, everything about the situation felt like stepping into a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. "I'll need to report this to my supervisor," Morrison said finally. "There are regulations about permanent structures on federal land." The man's expression darkened. "Report what you must, but understand that some things are better left undisturbed." Dr. Sarah Chen had seen unusual cases during her 15 years in pediatric genetics, but nothing had prepared her for the helicopter ride into Blackwood Valley. The federal marshals who had briefed her used words like anomalous and unprecedented, but their clinical language failed to convey the unease she felt. Reading Morrison's initial report, the helicopter touched down in a clearing half a mile from the Hartwell compound, close enough for easy access, but far enough to avoid alarming the family. Chen's team consisted of herself, 2 medical technicians, a social worker named Patricia Wells, and Deputy Marshal Frank Rodriguez. Each carried equipment designed for field medical assessments, but Chen suspected their instruments would prove inadequate for whatever awaited them. The walk to the compound followed the same faint trail Morrison had described. Chen noted the absence of normal forest sounds. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The silence felt oppressive, as if the valley itself held its breath. The crude fence appeared exactly as Morrison had described, but Chen was unprepared for her first glimpse of the Hartwell homestead. The building seemed to have grown from the earth rather than been constructed upon it. Weather had worn the wood to a silver-gray patina that blended with the mountain mist, creating an almost ethereal quality. Ezra Hartwell emerged from the main cabin as they approached, his pale eyes taking in each team member with calculating precision. Behind him, Chen could see faces in the windows, adults and children alike watching the intrusion with expressions she couldn't read. "Dr. Chen," Rodriguez announced formally, "we're here to conduct a welfare check on the children in your care." Ezra's laugh carried the same hollow quality Morrison had noted. "Welfare check? You speak as if we were neglecting our young ones. They are thriving, Marshal, thriving in ways your outside world could never understand." Chen stepped forward, adopting the gentle tone she used with frightened patience. "Mr. Hartwell, we're not here to cause trouble. We simply want to ensure the children are healthy and receiving proper care." "Proper care," Ezra repeated, savoring the words. "Tell me, Doctor, what do you consider proper care for children whose bloodline has been refined over 5 generations? Children who represent the culmination of our family's greatest achievement." The phrasing sent chills down Chen's spine, but she maintained her professional composure. "Perhaps we could meet the children. I'd like to perform some basic health screenings." Ezra gestured toward the cabin with a sweeping motion that seemed theatrical. "By all means. But I warn you, our children may not conform to your textbook expectations." The interior of the cabin defied Chen's assumptions about primitive living conditions. While the furnishings were handmade, they showed remarkable craftsmanship. More striking was the cleanliness. Every surface gleamed despite the absence of modern conveniences. The children sat arranged around a rough wooden table, their positions so perfectly aligned they might have been posed by an artist. Chen counted 7 of them, ranging in age from approximately 6 to 16. Each displayed the same unsettling physical characteristics Morrison had described: elongated limbs, translucent skin, and those enormous, colorless eyes. "Good afternoon," Chen said softly. None of the children responded verbally, but all 7 heads turned toward her in perfect unison, the movement so synchronized it seemed choreographed. Patricia Wells approached the youngest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The social worker knelt to bring herself to eye level, offering a gentle smile. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The child tilted her head at an angle that made Chen wince, then glanced toward Ezra as if seeking permission to respond. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "Names are for the outside world," the girl said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "Here we're simply family." Chen opened her medical bag and withdrew a digital thermometer. "May I take your temperature?" "It won't hurt." The girl extended her hand, palm up. Chen noticed immediately that the child's skin felt unnaturally cool, and the pulse in her wrist seemed slower than normal. When the thermometer beeped, it displayed a reading of 94.2 degrees, well below normal human body temperature. "Interesting," Chen murmured, making notes on her tablet. Ezra watched her work with amusement. "You'll find our children operate by different parameters than your medical textbooks suggest, Doctor. Adaptation is a remarkable thing when allowed to proceed without interference." Chen moved to examine another child, a boy who appeared to be around 12. His eyes tracked her movements with an intelligence that seemed far older than his apparent age. When she reached for his wrist to check his pulse, he pulled back with surprising speed. "He doesn't like to be touched by outsiders," Ezra explained. "None of them do. They can sense the contamination that comes from your world." "Contamination?" Rodriguez stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Ezra's smile revealed teeth that seemed too white, too perfect. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object wrapped in faded cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed a daguerreotype photograph. So old its silver surface had begun to tarnish. The image showed 2 people, clearly siblings, based on their shared features, standing before what appeared to be an earlier version of the current cabin. Both had the same pale coloring as the current family members, and their eyes held that same unsettling quality. "My great-great-grandparents," Ezra said with obvious pride. "Brother and sister united in purpose. They understood that purity requires sacrifice." Dr. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she documented her findings in the failing light of the cabin. Each measurement defied medical understanding. Each observation challenged her 15 years of pediatric training. The Hartwell children exhibited physiological characteristics that should have been impossible in living humans. The oldest boy, who appeared to be 16, possessed fingers that extended nearly 7 inches from knuckle to tip. When Chen measured his arm span, it exceeded his height by 14 inches, a ratio never recorded in medical literature. His joints bent at angles that suggested additional cartilage or bone structure modifications. "May I examine your teeth?" Chen asked the boy, trying to keep her voice steady. He opened his mouth obediently, revealing a dental structure that made Chen's breath catch. The teeth were arranged normally, but their shape was wrong. The incisors curved slightly inward, and the roots, visible through his pale gums, extended far deeper than human teeth should reach. Patricia Wells held up a small collection of what appeared to be baby teeth, found scattered on a shelf near the kitchen. "These fell out naturally?" she asked Ezra. "Children lose their first teeth to make room for their permanent ones," he replied, as if discussing the weather. "Though our children's development follows its own timeline," Chen examined the collected teeth under her magnifying glass. The root structures were unlike anything in her textbooks, branched and complex, resembling small trees more than human dental remains. Some showed evidence of having grown in unusual patterns, creating spaces that shouldn't exist in a normal mouth. The youngest girl approached Chen without being asked, extending her thin arm. Where normal children might have soft baby fat, this child's limbs showed every tendon and vein, through skin so translucent it appeared almost luminous. Chen could count the individual bones in her forearm simply by looking. "Does anything hurt?" Chen asked gently. The child shook her head, but the movement was wrong, too fluid, as if her neck contained more vertebrae than it should. "Pain is for those who fight their nature," she said in that whisper-soft voice. "We embrace what we are becoming." Chen's blood tests revealed results that challenged everything she understood about human physiology. The children's hemoglobin levels were 50% below normal ranges, yet they showed no signs of anemia. Their white blood cell counts were so low that any normal child would have died from infection within days. Most disturbing was what she found in their DNA samples. Using her portable genetic sequencer, Chen identified markers that didn't match any known human genetic patterns. Entire chromosome segments appeared to have been altered, not through random mutation, but in ways that suggested systematic modification over multiple generations. Their genetic diversity is essentially zero, she whispered to Rodriguez during a brief moment outside the cabin. They're more genetically similar than identical twins. This level of inbreeding should have resulted in immediate death or severe mental deficiency. But they seem intelligent, Rodriguez observed. Disturbingly so, Chen nodded grimly. That's what makes this impossible. By all laws of genetics, these children shouldn't exist. Yet here they are, not just surviving, but apparently thriving. Inside the cabin, the children had arranged themselves in a circle on the floor. They sat in perfect stillness, their pale eyes closed, but Chen could swear she saw their lips moving in silent unison. No sound emerged, yet the air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken communication. "What are they doing?" Patricia whispered. Ezra watched his children with obvious pride. They speak without words, share thoughts without touch. Isolation has freed them from the crude limitations of verbal language. Chen observed the children for nearly an hour. Their breathing synchronized perfectly. Their slight movements mirrored each other with precision that suggested shared consciousness. When one child's stomach rumbled with hunger, all seven immediately opened their eyes and moved toward the kitchen in perfect formation. The evening meal consisted of ingredients Chen couldn't identify, roots and herbs that must have grown wild in the valley, prepared in ways that seemed more ritual than cuisine. The children ate in complete silence, their movements coordinated as if following an invisible conductor. "How do they learn?" Chen asked Ezra. "Do you teach them to read, to write?" "They learn what they need to know," he replied. "Knowledge passes between them like water flowing downhill. What one understands, all understand." As darkness fell, Chen made her final observations of the day. The children moved through the cabin without artificial light, navigating with certainty that suggested enhanced night vision. Their pale eyes seemed to gather and concentrate whatever minimal light filtered through the windows. Outside, Chen could hear sounds that didn't belong to any normal forest. Rustling that was too organized, calls that were too musical. When she peered through the window, she thought she saw additional figures moving between the buildings, shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. "How many people live here?" she asked Ezra. His smile revealed those unnaturally perfect teeth. "Family comes in many forms, Doctor. Not all of our relations are visible to outsiders." Chen's final notes that evening recorded the impossible. Children whose genetic makeup should have killed them, whose physical development defied medical understanding, whose behavior suggested cognitive abilities far beyond normal human capacity. She had come to assess their health and found instead something that challenged her understanding of what human beings could become. The morning brought an unsettling revelation about Ezra Hartwell's true nature. Dr. Chen found him awake before dawn, sitting motionless on the cabin's front porch, as if he had been there all night. His pale eyes reflected the first hints of sunlight with an almost metallic gleam, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades, despite his apparent middle age. "You're trying to understand us through the lens of your medical training," Ezra said without preamble, as if continuing a conversation they had never started. "But we are beyond your classifications now, Doctor." Chen approached cautiously, noting how Ezra's breathing seemed almost imperceptible. His chest rose and fell perhaps once every 30 seconds, far too slow for a living human. Yet he showed no signs of distress, no blue tinge to his lips or fingertips that would indicate oxygen deprivation. "How old are you, Mr. Hartwell?" His laugh held no warmth. "Age is measured differently when your bloodline has been purified across generations. My body carries the accumulated wisdom of every ancestor who contributed to my creation." From his coat pocket, Ezra withdrew an object that made Chen's breath catch. An iron key, worn smooth by countless hands. The metal had been shaped by a blacksmith rather than machine-made, its surface bearing the patina of extreme age. Strange symbols had been carved into the key's shaft, markings that seemed to shift in the changing light. "This key has been passed from father to son for 5 generations, Ezra said, turning the object slowly in his fingers. "It opens doors that outsiders cannot see, unlocks understanding that your world has forgotten." Chen noticed how the key seemed to respond to Ezra's touch, the metal warming until it glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. "What does it unlock?" "Knowledge, truth, the culmination of our family's greatest work." Ezra's eyes fixed on Chen with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Would you like to see, Doctor? Would you like to understand what 5 generations of careful breeding can accomplish?" Before Chen could respond, Rodriguez emerged from the shelter they had erected the previous evening. The deputy marshal's hand rested on his weapon, his training evident in the way he positioned himself between Chen and Ezra. "Everything all right here, Doc?" Ezra's smile revealed those perfect teeth. "The good marshal is concerned for your safety, how touching. But I assure you Dr. Chen is in no danger from me. We are, after all, civilized people." The way he emphasized the word civilized carried implications that made Chen's stomach turn. She had spent the night reviewing her notes, and the pattern emerging from her observations defied rational explanation. The Hartwell family wasn't simply the product of genetic isolation. They represented something deliberately cultivated over multiple generations. "Tell me about your ancestors," Chen said. "The ones in the photograph you showed us yesterday." Ezra's expression grew reverent. "Marcus and Sarah Hartwell, brother and sister, united in purpose when they first came to this valley, and they understood what your modern world has forgotten, that humanity's greatest potential can only be unlocked through absolute purity of bloodline." "But the genetic risks," Ezra interrupted. "Doctor, you speak of risks while looking at the evidence of our success. My children represent the 5th generation of systematic refinement. Each generation has grown stronger, more capable, more perfectly adapted to our isolated existence." Chen noticed movement in the cabin windows. The children were awake, their pale faces pressed against the glass as they watched the conversation unfold. Even at this distance, she could see their eyes tracking every gesture, every word, as if they were absorbing information through observation alone. "The outside world breeds chaos," Ezra continued. "Random mixing of bloodlines, weakening of genetic strength through diversity. We have chosen a different path, concentration rather than dilution, purity rather than contamination." He stood with fluid grace that seemed to defy his apparent age. Despite claiming to be in his 50s, Ezra moved like a much younger man, his joints showing none of the stiffness that typically comes with middle age. "You have no formal education," Chen observed. "No medical training. How did you develop this understanding of genetics?" "Knowledge passes through bloodlines, as surely as physical traits," Ezra replied. "What my ancestors learned, I have inherited. What I understand, my children will The iron key caught the morning light again, and Chen realized that Ezra had been testing her reactions, measuring her responses to his revelations. Behind his pale eyes she glimpsed an intelligence that was both ancient and alien, as if decades of isolation had transformed not just his family's bodies, but their very consciousness. "The key opens a door in the basement," Ezra said quietly. "Behind that door lies the proof of our success, and the evidence of what happens to those who fail to meet our standards." Chen felt Rodriguez tense beside her. The implications of Ezra's words hung in the morning air like a physical presence, promising revelations that might be too terrible to witness. The basement door stood behind the main cabin, hidden beneath a wooden covering that blended seamlessly with the forest floor. Chen hadn't noticed it during her initial survey of the compound, but now she realized the concealment was deliberate. Ezra inserted the iron key with ceremonial precision, the ancient metal sliding into a lock that seemed far more complex than necessary for a simple storage space. "Before you see what lies beneath," Ezra said, his hand pausing on the key, "you must understand that everything my family has accomplished required difficult choices. Evolution demands sacrifice." The door opened to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. The air that rose from below carried scents that made Chen's medical training scream warnings: the metallic tang of old blood, the sweet corruption of decay, and something else she couldn't identify, but that triggered primal fear responses. Rodriguez drew his flashlight, the LED beam cutting through shadows that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The basement stretched further than the cabin's foundation should have allowed, carved directly from the mountain's bedrock. Shelves lined the walls, filled with objects that told a story of systematic genetic manipulation spanning more than a century. The first shelf contained what appeared to be medical journals, but as Chen examined them more closely, she realized they were handwritten breeding records. The crude leather binding was made from animal hide, stitched with sinew rather than thread. The pages within documented births, deaths, and genetic observations recorded in multiple handwritings across decades. 5 generations of careful documentation, Ezra explained, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. Each entry represents a step toward perfection, a movement away from the chaos of random breeding toward systematic improvement. Chen opened the oldest journal, dated. The first entry was written in a careful, educated hand. "Day 1. Marcus and I have arrived in the valley. The isolation is complete. No roads, no neighbors, no contamination from the outside world. Here we shall begin the great work, the purification of human bloodline through controlled breeding. God has shown us the path to perfection." The entries continued chronologically, documenting the union between Marcus and Sarah Hartwell and the birth of their children. Chen's hands shook as she read accounts of deliberate inbreeding, of children who were judged successful or defective, based on their conformity to an ideal that grew more disturbing with each page. The early generations faced challenges, Ezra admitted. Many children were born with deformities that rendered them unsuitable for the continuation of our line, but gradually, through careful selection and patient dedication, we began to see results. Rodriguez's flashlight fell upon another shelf containing glass jars filled with preserved specimens. Chen's medical training allowed her to identify what floated in the yellowing preservative fluid: malformed fetuses. Children who had been born but failed to survive, body parts that showed the genetic damage caused by extreme inbreeding. "Dear God," Rodriguez whispered. "God guided our work," Ezra corrected. "These were the necessary failures that led to our eventual success. Every great achievement requires experimentation, refinement, the willingness to discard what proves inadequate." Chen found entries documenting the systematic elimination of children deemed genetically inferior. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what she was reading. Generations of infanticide disguised as selective breeding, families that had murdered their own children in pursuit of genetic purity. "You killed them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We allowed the strong to survive and prevented the weak from diluting our bloodline," Ezra replied without emotion. Nature herself practices such selection, but with less intelligence and purpose than we have brought to the process. The breeding records revealed the true scope of the Hartwell experiment. Charts documented which combinations of siblings produced the most desirable offspring, tracking genetic traits across generations like livestock breeding records. Children were assigned numerical values based on their conformity to physical and mental standards that grew more extreme with each generation. The fourth generation marked our breakthrough, Ezra said, turning to a section of the journal marked with a red ribbon. Children began to manifest abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Enhanced sensory perception, telepathic communication, physical adaptations that allowed them to thrive in isolation. Chen read entries describing children who could see in complete darkness, who shared thoughts without speaking, whose bodies operated at temperatures and metabolic rates that should have been fatal. The records suggested that extreme inbreeding, rather than weakening the family line, had somehow unlocked latent human potential. "This is impossible," Chen murmured. "Genetic science doesn't work this way." "Your genetic science is based on the study of contaminated bloodlines," Ezra replied. "You have never observed what happens when human genetics are purified over multiple generations, refined through careful selection toward a specific ideal." The final shelf contained the most disturbing evidence, photographs documenting the physical transformation of the Hartwell family across generations. The earliest images showed normal-appearing people, but each subsequent generation displayed increasingly pronounced physical abnormalities. By the fourth generation, the subjects barely resembled baseline humans. "We have become something new," Ezra said with obvious pride. "Something better adapted to exist without the crutches your modern world depends upon. We are humanity's future, Doctor. What your species could become if it had the courage to embrace purity over diversity." Patricia Wells had worked with traumatized children for over a decade, but nothing had prepared her for observing the Hartwell children during their afternoon activity. While Dr. Chen documented medical anomalies and Rodriguez maintained security protocols, Patricia focused on behavioral patterns that grew more disturbing with each passing hour. Even modern GPS mapping showed the valley as an empty wilderness area with no structures or signs of habitation. The satellite photos had been digitally altered to hide the Hartwell compound. This level of cover-up requires federal involvement, Rodriguez. Multiple agencies sustained over decades. The question is why? What makes one isolated family worth protecting for over a century? As if summoned by their conversation, Ezra appeared at the edge of their campsite. He moved with that fluid, almost gliding motion that characterized all the family members, approaching without making a sound despite the dry leaves covering the forest floor. "You're learning about our history," he observed, his pale eyes reflecting their flashlight beams. "But history is written by those who survive to tell it. The truth is often more complex than official records suggest." Rodriguez's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "What truth is that, Mr. Hartwell?" "The truth that some experiments are too valuable to abandon, Marshall, too important to allow moral squeamishness to interfere with scientific progress." Dr. Chen's comprehensive genetic analysis revealed results that challenged every principle of human biology she had learned during 2 decades of medical practice. Working late into the night with her portable laboratory equipment, she documented genetic markers that shouldn't exist in any living organism, let alone human beings. The blood samples from the Hartwell children contained DNA sequences that defied classification. Entire chromosome segments had been altered in ways that suggested not random mutation, but systematic modification across multiple generations. Most disturbing was the discovery of genetic material that didn't match any known human population. "Look at this," Chen whispered to Rodriguez, showing him the genetic sequences display. "These children have genetic markers that are completely unique, not variations of normal human genes, entirely new sequences that I can't find in any database." The implications were staggering. Either the Hartwell family had developed unprecedented genetic mutations through extreme inbreeding, or they had been exposed to something that altered their DNA at a fundamental level. Chen's investigation of the valley's water supply provided a potential answer. The family drew water from a spring that emerged from deep within the mountain, and chemical analysis revealed the presence of a crystalline substance unlike anything in her reference materials. The compound appeared to be naturally occurring, but its molecular structure was so complex that her equipment couldn't fully analyze it. She collected a vial of the strange substance, noting how it seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence in the dark. When she placed a drop under her portable microscope, the crystals appeared to move, restructuring themselves in patterns that suggested some form of internal organization. "The water contains a mineral compound that I can't identify," Chen explained to her team. "It's possible that generations of exposure to this substance have caused the genetic modifications we're observing." Patricia Wells examined the vial with growing concern. Could this explain the children's unusual abilities, their apparent telepathic communication?
"I don't know," Chen admitted, "but I'm beginning to suspect that what we're dealing with isn't purely genetic. There may be an environmental component that's been affecting the family for over a century." The medical examinations revealed that the children's bodies had adapted to process the mysterious compound in ways that normal human physiology couldn't accommodate. Their kidneys showed structural modifications that allowed them to filter and concentrate the substance rather than excrete it. Their nervous systems had developed additional neural pathways that might explain their enhanced sensory capabilities. Most shocking was the discovery that the compound was actively rewriting their DNA. Chen found evidence of ongoing genetic modification at the cellular level, as if the substance was systematically optimizing their bodies for survival in the isolated environment. "This isn't evolution," Chen realized with growing horror. "This is directed mutation. Something in their environment is actively changing them, generation after generation, creating a new form of life that's adapted specifically to this valley." Rodriguez examined the spring where the family collected their water. The source emerged from a cave that extended deep into the mountain, and his flashlight revealed walls that glowed with the same phosphorescent quality as the crystalline compound in the water. "How deep does this cave system go?" he asked Ezra, who had followed them to the spring. "Deep enough to reach the heart of the mountain," Ezra replied. "Deep enough to touch the source of our transformation." Chen collected rock samples from the cave walls, noting how the phosphorescent material seemed to toll with its own internal rhythm. The substance wasn't just present in the water, it permeated the very stone of the mountain, creating an environment that was slowly but steadily altering any life form exposed to it over extended periods. "You knew about this?" Chen accused Ezra. "You knew that something in this valley was changing your family." Ezra's smile held that familiar coldness. "Our ancestors were guided here for a purpose, Doctor. They recognized that this place offered something beyond normal human experience, the opportunity to transcend the limitations of baseline humanity." The genetic analysis revealed that each generation of the Hartwell family had been more dramatically affected by the compound than the last. The current children showed genetic modifications that were exponentially more extensive than their parents, suggesting an accelerating process of transformation. "What are you becoming?" Chen asked, though she feared the answer. "Something better," Ezra replied. "Something perfectly adapted to exist in harmony with forces that your science cannot comprehend. My children represent humanity's next evolutionary step, beings who have moved beyond the crude biological limitations that constrain your species." Chen's final tests revealed the most disturbing finding of all. The compound in the family's bloodstream was changing in real time, becoming more concentrated and more complex with each passing day. The children weren't just carriers of genetic mutations, they were active laboratories where some unknown force was conducting experiments in human transformation. "This has to be reported to the CDC," Chen told Rodriguez, private. "Whatever's happening here could represent a threat to human populations if it spreads beyond this valley." But even as she spoke, Chen realized that their discovery might be part of a larger plan that had been in motion for over a century. The morning of the third day brought the first signs of organized resistance from the Hartwell family. Dr. Chen arrived at the cabin to find the children arranged in a defensive formation on the front porch, their pale eyes tracking her movement with predatory intensity that sent chills down her spine. "Good morning," Chen called out, trying to maintain her professional composure despite the obvious change in atmosphere. None of the children responded. They sat in perfect stillness, but Chen could sense the tension radiating from their small forms. Behind them, adult family members emerged from the cabin, more than she had seen before, including several individuals who had apparently been hidden during the previous day's examinations. Ezra stepped forward, his demeanor transformed from cooperative to openly hostile. "Your examination period has concluded, Doctor. My family will no longer submit to your tests and observations." Rodriguez moved closer to Chen, his hand resting on his radio. "Mr. Hartwell, we're conducting a legally authorized investigation. Your cooperation isn't optional. Legal authority." Ezra's laugh carried a harsh edge. "Marshal, you speak of legal authority while standing on land that existed before your laws, inhabited by people whose bloodline predates your government's jurisdiction." Chen noticed movement in the surrounding forest. Shapes that glided between the trees with the same fluid motion characteristic of the family members. The Hartwells had been watching and preparing, and Chen realized they were no longer dealing with a passive, isolated family, but with something approaching an organized defense force. "How many of you are there?" Chen asked. "Enough," Ezra replied. "Enough to protect what we have built, enough to preserve what we have become." From the barn, Chen heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a complex rhythm created by striking animal bones and stretched sinew. The primitive alarm system she had glimpsed earlier was now active, sending signals throughout the valley in patterns too intricate for coincidence. The children on the porch began to hum, the same single tone Chen had observed during their evening rituals. But now the sound carried further, echoing from hidden locations throughout the forest. The entire valley seemed to vibrate with the coordinated vocalizations of dozens of voices. "You're calling others," Rodriguez realized, reaching for his weapons. "We are announcing your presence to our extended family," Ezra corrected. "They have been watching you since the moment you entered our valley, assessing whether you represent a threat to our existence." Chen's portable equipment began to malfunction, displays flickering, and electronic devices emitting high-pitched whines. The electromagnetic effects suggested that whatever force was affecting the family's genetics was also capable of interfering with technology. "We need to leave," Rodriguez urged, but Chen noticed that their path back to the helicopter landing zone was no longer clear. Figures moved through the trees, positioning themselves to block potential escape routes. "Leaving would be inadvisable," Ezra said, as if reading their thoughts. "The valley has ways of protecting itself from those who would carry tales to the outside world." Patricia Wells emerged from behind the cabin, her face pale with fear. "They've been watching us constantly," she whispered. "I found observation posts throughout the forest, primitive structures that give them complete surveillance of the entire area." Chen examined the alarm system more closely, marveling at its sophisticated, despite its primitive construction. Bones had been selected and modified to create specific tones when struck, while sinew strings had been tuned to carry vibrations across great distances. The system allowed instant communication throughout the valley, using methods that would leave no electronic signature. "Your ancestors built this?" Chen asked. "Our ancestors began it," Ezra replied. "Each generation has refined and expanded the network. We can communicate across the entire valley in seconds, coordinate responses to threats, summon assistance from hidden settlements throughout these mountains." The implications hit Chen like a physical blow. The Hartwell compound wasn't an isolated homestead. It was part of a larger network of settlements connected by communication systems and shared purpose. They weren't dealing with one family but with an entire community of genetically modified humans. "How many settlements?" Rodriguez demanded. "Enough to ensure our survival," Ezra repeated. "Enough to guarantee that our bloodline will continue regardless of interference from outsiders." The children's humming grew louder, joined now by adult voices from multiple directions. The sound created harmonics that seemed to resonate through Chen's bones, triggering physiological responses she couldn't explain. Her vision began to blur, and she felt a strange compulsion to approach the family members despite every instinct screaming warnings. "What are you doing to us?" Chen gasped, demonstrating why leaving would be inadvisable. Ezra replied calmly, "You have seen too much, learned too much, to be allowed to return to your world unchanged." Ezra's decision to unlock the basement's deepest chamber came after hours of escalating tension. The iron key turned in a second lock, hidden behind a false wall that Chen hadn't noticed during her previous examination of the underground space. The door opened to reveal a room that defied the crude construction of the rest of the compound, carved from solid stone with precision that suggested tools far more advanced than anything the isolated family should have possessed. The chamber stretched back into the mountain itself, its walls lined with alcoves containing preserved remains that made Chen's medical training recoil in horror. But these weren't the malformed infants she had seen in the outer basement. These were fully developed children and adults, their bodies displaying modifications so extreme they barely retained human appearance. "The failures," Ezra said without emotion, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Those who could not adapt to the transformation, whose genetics proved insufficient for our purposes." Chen approached the nearest alcove, where a stone altar held the remains of what had once been a teenage girl. The body showed signs of deliberate preservation, and the modifications were unlike anything in medical literature. Extra limbs had begun to develop from her spine, while her skull had elongated to accommodate brain growth that had ultimately proved fatal. "You experimented on your own children," Chen whispered. "We guided their development toward perfection," Ezra corrected. "Some paths lead to success, others to necessary sacrifice." Rodriguez counted more than 30 alcoves, each containing remains that told a story of genetic manipulation gone wrong. The bodies showed evidence of surgical modification, chemical treatment, and procedures that had been conducted while the subjects were still alive. "Dear God," Patricia breathed, examining a collection of children's remains that showed signs of having been systematically dissected. They were conscious during these procedures. Consciousness was necessary for proper observation of results, Ezra explained clinically. "Pain is simply sensation, and sensation provides data about the effectiveness of modifications." The stone altar at the chamber's center bore dark stains that even decades couldn't completely erase. Carved channels in the stone guided blood flow toward collection vessels, creating a drainage system designed for repeated use. The altar's surface showed wear patterns that suggested hundreds of procedures had been performed over multiple generations. Chen found surgical instruments crafted from the same strange metal as Ezra's key, their edges still sharp despite obvious age. The tools showed modifications that indicated they had been designed for procedures on anatomy that differed significantly from baseline human structure. "Who taught you to perform these operations?" Chen asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Knowledge passed through bloodlines," Ezra replied, but his tone suggested there was more to the story. "Though we received guidance from those who understood our purpose better than we initially did ourselves." The chamber's walls bore inscriptions in the same symbolic language Chen had seen on the wooden cross and iron key. The markings appeared to be procedural notes, documenting techniques for genetic modification that were both sophisticated and utterly inhumane. Patricia discovered a section of the chamber dedicated to what appeared to be breeding experiments. Stone slabs held the remains of infants who had been subjected to chemical treatments designed to accelerate or alter their development. Some showed signs of having grown to maturity in a matter of weeks, rather than years. "You weren't just practicing selective breeding," Chen realized with growing horror. "You were conducting active genetic modification, treating your own family members as laboratory subjects." "We were perfecting humanity," Ezra replied with chilling pride. "Each generation brought us closer to our goal, beings capable of existing beyond the limitations that constrain your species." The chamber's deepest section revealed the most disturbing evidence yet. A collection of glass containers held preserved organs that had been removed from living subjects, their cellular structure modified by exposure to the crystalline compound found in the valley's water supply. Heart tissue showed additional chambers, brain matter displayed in enlarged sections, and reproductive organs had been altered in ways that suggested preparation for non-human reproduction. "What were you trying to create?" Rodriguez demanded. "The next step in human evolution," Ezra answered. "Beings adapted to exist in harmony with forces beyond your understanding, capable of survival in environments that would kill normal humans." Chen examined documentation scratched into the stone walls, recording procedures and results across multiple decades. The experiments had grown more sophisticated over time, suggesting that the family's knowledge had been expanding through means other than trial and error. "Someone was teaching you," Chen concluded. "Someone with advanced knowledge of genetic modification was guiding your experiment." Sagra's smile revealed those perfect, inhuman teeth. "The mountain itself teaches those willing to listen. The forces that changed our water supply, that altered our genetics, have purposes beyond your comprehension." The stone altar's surface reflected the chamber's phosphorescent lighting in patterns that seemed to move independently of the light source. Chen realized that even the altar itself had been modified by exposure to the same force that was transforming the family. The psychological breaking point came when Dr. Chen discovered the family's mirror, a polished metal surface that had been crafted from the same strange material found throughout the valley. When she looked into it, expecting to see her own reflection, the image that stared back was subtly but fundamentally wrong. Her features appeared distorted, elongated in ways that mimicked the Hartwell family's characteristics. Her eyes seemed larger, more reflective, while her skin took on the translucent quality she had observed in the children. The reflection showed not what she was, but what she might become if exposed to the valley's transformative influence for an extended period. "The mirror shows truth," Ezra explained, appearing behind her with that unsettling silent movement. "It reveals the potential that exists within every human bloodline, the perfection that can be achieved through proper guide." Chan stepped back from the mirror, but the distorted reflection remained burned into her memory. Around the cabin, other mirrors made from the same material showed similar distortions, suggesting that the family saw themselves not as the pale, elongated beings they had become, but as perfected versions of humanity. "This is how you see yourselves?" Chan asked, her voice shaking. "This is how we truly are," Ezra replied. "The mirror strips away the illusions that prevent normal humans from recognizing their own limitations." Patricia Wells examined her own reflection and immediately turned away, her face pale with shock. In the mirror, she appeared aged and withered, her features twisted by what looked like disease or genetic decay. The contrast between her normal appearance and the reflected image was so stark, it suggested the mirror was responding to more than simple light reflection. "It's reading our genetics," Chen realized, "somehow analyzing our biological structure and projecting what it considers our true form."
The children gathered around the mirror, their reflections appearing bright and luminous compared to the distorted images of the outsiders. In the polished surface, they looked like beings of light, their pale skin glowing with an inner radiance that suggested transcendence of normal human limitations. Rodriguez refused to look at his own reflection after seeing the others' reactions, but Chen caught a glimpse of his image in the mirror's edge. The deputy marshal appeared as something predatory and violent, his features sharpened into angles that suggested barely contained aggression. "The mirror reveals what lies beneath," Ezra continued. "Your friend sees himself as a hunter, a killer trained by your government to use violence against those who threaten established order. The social worker sees herself as she truly is, aging, decaying, fighting a losing battle against time and biology. You, doctor, see the potential for transformation that frightens you more than death itself." Chen forced herself to look again, studying the way her reflection seemed to shift and change in the strange metal surface. The distortions weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested systematic modification, as if the mirror were showing her a possible future rather than a distorted present. "What happens to people who stay in this valley too long?" she asked. They evolve, Ezra replied. They shed the limitations of their birth genetics and embrace the perfection that the mountain offers to those wise enough to accept its gifts. The mirror's surface began to ripple, despite being solid metal, creating waves that distorted the reflections further. Chen watched her own image stretch and compress, showing her features modified in dozens of different ways. Some changes appeared beneficial: enhanced sensory organs, improved physical capabilities. Others were disturbing, alterations that pushed the boundaries of what could still be considered human. The process can be guided, Ezra explained. With proper preparation and willing acceptance, transformation can be directed toward specific improvements. Resistance makes the changes random, often fatal. Chen realized that the mirror wasn't just showing potential, it was serving as a form of psychological conditioning, preparing viewers for the physical changes they would undergo if exposed to the valley's influence for extended periods. "You use this to recruit new family members," she said. "You show people what they could become, convince them to stay and be transformed. We offer evolution to those ready to embrace it," Ezra confirmed. "Your world clings to primitive genetics, refuses to accept the improvements that are freely offered. We have moved beyond such limitations." The mirror's surface settled back into stillness, but the reflections continued to show the distorted images. Chen understood that what she was seeing represented more than optical illusion. It was a glimpse into the family's true perception of reality. "This is why you believe you're superior," Chen said. "The mirror convinces you that normal humans are flawed, while you represent perfection. The mirror reveals truth," Ezra repeated. "Whether that truth brings joy or terror depends entirely on the observer's willingness to accept reality." Patricia began to show signs of psychological breakdown, her hands shaking as she stared at the floor to avoid seeing any reflections. The cumulative effect of the family's revelations, combined with the mirror's disturbing images, was pushing all three investigators toward their emotional limits. The discovery of the hidden letters came by accident when Patricia Wells knocked over an old wooden chest while backing away from the disturbing mirror. The container spilled its contents across the cabin floor, dozens of yellowed papers tied with ribbons, each bundle representing years of correspondence that had never been sent to the outside world. Chen knelt among the scattered letters, her hands trembling as she read words that revealed the true scope of the Hartwell family's imprisonment. The earliest letter was dated 1923, written in a woman's careful script. "Dearest Mother, I pray this letter somehow reaches you, though I know it never can. I've tried to leave this place, to return to the world I remember from childhood, but they watch constantly. My children are not my own anymore. They belong to the experiment, to the thing that grows in the mountain's heart." Rodriguez picked up another bundle, these letters dating from the 1950s and written in a man's increasingly desperate handwriting. "I understand now why Father brought us here, why he insisted we stay even as Mother begged to leave. The thing in the cave spoke to him in dreams, showed him visions of what we could become. But the price is too high. My sister's children were born wrong, and when I tried to take them to a doctor in town, they stopped me. They said the bloodline must remain pure." Patricia found letters from the 1980s that described multiple escape attempts, each ending in capture and punishment. They caught Samuel at the valley's edge. When they brought him back, he was changed, not just beaten, but altered somehow. His eyes had gone pale like theirs, and he spoke of accepting his role in the family's destiny. "I think they did something to his mind, made him forget why he wanted to leave." Chen discovered the most disturbing correspondence, letters written by children who had been born into the family but retained enough individual consciousness to recognize their situation as imprisonment. "I am 12 years old, and I want to go to school like the children I read about in the old books. But Father says the outside world would poison my blood, make me sick and weak. He shows me the mirror and tells me I'm becoming something beautiful. But I think I am becoming something terrible. The letters revealed that resistance to the family's breeding program had existed in every generation, but had been systematically crushed through methods that grew more sophisticated over time. Early dissenters had been physically restrained or beaten into submission. Later generations faced psychological manipulation and chemical treatment that altered their brain chemistry. They've been drugging their own family members, Chen realized. Reading a letter that described food being treated with substances that made thinking difficult and compliance easier. Ezra appeared in the cabin doorway, his expression showing mild annoyance rather than surprise at their discovery. "Every family has members who fail to appreciate the significance of their bloodline," he said calmly. "These letters represent the complaints of those too weak to embrace their destiny. These are cries for help," Patricia insisted, clutching a bundle of letters written by children. "Pleas from people who were being held against their will. They were being protected from their own ignorance," Ezra corrected. "The outside world would have destroyed them, corrupted their genetics with random breeding and chemical contamination. We preserved their purity, despite their inability to understand the gift they had been given." Rodriguez found letters describing the fate of family members who had persistently resisted. "They took Marcus to the basement yesterday. When they brought him back, he wasn't Marcus anymore. He'd looked the same, but his mind was gone. Now he sits with the others and hums their songs. And when I try to talk to him about leaving, he stares at me like I'm speaking a foreign language." The correspondence painted a picture of systematic brainwashing and genetic manipulation spanning multiple generations. Family members who showed independent thinking were subjected to procedures that altered their brain chemistry, making them compliant and docile. "The mirror isn't just for recruitment," Chen understood. "You use it as part of the conditioning process. You show people distorted images until they accept your version of reality. We help them see truth," Ezra replied. "The mirror simply removes the illusions that prevent proper understanding of their situation." The most recent letters were written in the 1990s, but their content suggested that active resistance had been almost completely eliminated by that point. The final letter, dated just 5 years ago, was written in a shaking hand. "I'm the last one who remembers what we were before the changes began. Everyone else has accepted the transformation, forgotten what it means to be human. I write this knowing no one will ever read it, but I need to record the truth. We are not becoming something better. We are becoming something that was never meant to exist." Chen realized that the letters represented the last voices of dissent within the Hartwell family, the final evidence that normal human consciousness had once existed among the pale, elongated beings who now inhabited the valley. The final confrontation began when Rodriguez made the decision that the children had to be removed from the compound immediately, regardless of the family's resistance. He activated his emergency beacon, calling for federal backup while Chen and Patricia gathered their equipment for an urgent evacuation. "This ends now," Rodriguez declared, drawing his weapon as Ezra emerged from the cabin with the ceremonial knife Chen had seen in the basement chamber. The blade gleamed with the same phosphorescent quality as the valley's mysterious mineral deposits, and its edge appeared to cut the air itself as Ezra moved. "You understand nothing," Ezra replied, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath their feet. "You cannot remove what has already been transformed. You cannot save what has chosen evolution over stagnation." The children appeared on the cabin's porch, but they no longer resembled the pale, quiet beings Chen had initially examined. Their eyes blazed with phosphorescent light, and their movements showed coordination that defied individual consciousness. They moved as parts of a single organism, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next. "Stay back," Rodriguez warned, but his voice lacked conviction. The children's synchronized behavior had moved beyond unsettling into something genuinely supernatural. The oldest boy stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone far older than his apparent 16 years. Marshal Rodriguez, you were sent here to document our existence, not to interfere with our development. Your superiors understand our value to the future of human evolution. Rodriguez's radio crackled with static, then fell silent despite showing full battery power. The electromagnetic interference was intensifying, creating a dead zone that prevented communication with the outside world. Chen watched in horror as the children began to change before her eyes. Their pale skin took on the glowing quality she had seen in the mirror's reflections, while their elongated limbs stretched further, becoming almost spider-like in their proportions. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was happening in real time, as if triggered by the confrontation. "What are you doing to them?" Patricia screamed. "We are becoming what we were always meant to be," Ezra replied, raising the ceremonial knife above his head. The blade caught the morning light and reflected it in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The adult family members emerged from hidden positions throughout the compound, their numbers far exceeding what Chen had estimated. She counted at least 20 individuals, all showing various stages of the transformation that was now accelerating in the children. "You've been calling them," Chen realized. "The entire network of settlements. They're all coming here." "The convergence was always planned for this moment," Ezra confirmed. "When outsiders finally discovered our existence, when the time came to choose between concealment and revelation, Rodriguez aimed his weapon at Ezra, but hesitated as he realized that the knife-wielding patriarch was surrounded by children. Any attempt to stop the ceremony would put the young ones at risk, regardless of how transformed they had become. The children's humming began again, but now it carried physical force. The sound waves struck Chen like a physical blow, disrupting her balance and making coherent thought difficult. The harmonics seemed designed to interfere with normal brain function, creating a state of confusion and compliance. "The knife has been passed down through 5 generations," Ezra announced, his voice somehow audible despite the overwhelming sound. "Each patriarch has used it to complete the transformation of family members who showed resistance to our evolution." Chen understood with dawning horror that they were witnessing a sacrificial ritual. The ceremonial knife wasn't just a symbol, it was a tool used to permanently alter the brain. Chemistry of family members who retained too much individual consciousness. "You're going to use it on us," she gasped. "We are going to complete your transformation," Ezra corrected. "You have been exposed to our valley's influence for 3 days. The change has already begun in your cellular structure. The knife simply accelerates the process, makes it irreversible." Patricia collapsed to her knees as the humming intensified. Blood trickled from her nose, and her eyes showed signs of the same phosphorescent glow that characterized the family members. Rodriguez made a desperate decision, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the valley, but instead of frightening the family members, it seemed to energize them. Their movements became more coordinated, more purposeful. "Violence will not save you," the oldest boy said with that unnaturally mature voice. "Violence will only make your transformation more painful." Chen realized that their exposure to the valley's influence had progressed further than she had understood. Looking at her hands, she could see the faint beginnings of the translucent quality that characterized the family's skin. The change was irreversible, and fighting it would only make the process more traumatic. Patricia Wells broke first, her psychological conditioning as a social worker, compelling her to protect the children, even as her rational mind recognized the impossibility of their situation. During the chaos of the confrontation, she spotted what appeared to be an escape route, a rope ladder hidden behind the barn that led up the steep valley wall. "This way," she whispered to Chen and Rodriguez, gesturing toward the concealed ladder while Ezra was distracted by the ritual preparations. "Someone tried to escape before us. The ladder was old but sturdy, constructed from mountain hemp and secured to iron rings driven deep into the rock face. Each rung showed wear from previous use, evidence that multiple family members had attempted this same desperate climb over the decades. Chen hesitated, looking back at the transformed children who were now glowing with increasing intensity. Her medical training demanded that she try to help them, but her survival instincts screamed that staying would mean becoming something no longer human. "We can't leave them," she said. "We can't save them," Rodriguez replied grimly, already starting up the ladder. "Look at them, Doc. They're not children anymore." "There's something else entirely." Patricia began climbing, her movements fueled by panic as the humming behind them reached a crescendo that made the mountain itself seem to vibrate. The sound carried notes that triggered primal fear responses, suggesting that whatever the family was becoming had moved far beyond normal human capabilities. Halfway up the cliff face, Chen looked back to see the entire compound glowing with phosphorescent light. The family members had formed a circle around the ceremonial altar, with Ezra at the center holding the knife above his head. But the children were no longer passive participants. They were directing the ritual, their synchronized movements controlling the energy that pulsed through the valley. "They're not victims," Chen realized with growing horror. "They're the ones in charge. The children are controlling the adults, not the other way around." The rope ladder swayed dangerously as they climbed, the ancient fibers beginning to fray under the combined weight of 3 adults. Below them, the compound's glow intensified, and Chen could see figures beginning to pursue them up the cliff face, moving with the same spider-like agility she had observed in the children. "Faster," Rodriguez urged, but Patricia was already at her physical limits. Her hands were bleeding from gripping the rough rope, and her breathing came in short gasps that suggested cardiovascular distress. The pursuit was gaining ground. Chen could see at least 6 figures climbing the rock face without the aid of the ladder, their elongated limbs allowing them to find handholds in seemingly smooth stone. Their movements were perfectly coordinated, as if they shared a single mind directing multiple bodies. "There!" Patricia gasped, pointing to a cave opening about 20 feet above them. Someone carved steps into the rock. The crude stairway had been chiseled from living stone, probably by a family member who had spent months preparing this escape route. Each step was shallow but secure, offering better footing than the increasingly unreliable rope ladder. They reached the cave entrance just as the first pursuer arrived at the ladder's base. The figure looked up at them with eyes that blazed like stars, its features so elongated that it barely retained human appearance. When it spoke, its voice carried the harmonics that had proven so disorienting in the compound. "You cannot escape what you have already become," it called. "The transformation has begun in your cells. Fighting it will only make the process more painful." Inside the cave, Chen discovered evidence of previous escape attempts. Sleeping areas carved from stone, water collection systems, and caches of preserved food suggested that family members had hidden here for extended periods while planning their flights to freedom. But more disturbing were the remains they found deeper in the cave, bones that showed signs of the same extreme modifications observed in the basement chamber. These were the bodies of family members who had tried to escape but had been caught and punished. Their genetics altered so drastically that survival became impossible. "They hunt down anyone who tries to leave," Rodriguez realized, examining the scattered bones. "This isn't just a family compound. It's a prison designed to keep genetic experiments from escaping into the outside world." The cave system extended deep into the mountain, offering multiple passages that might lead to freedom. But Chen could hear sounds of pursuit echoing from behind them, not just the family members they had seen, but additional voices that suggested the entire network of settlements was mobilizing to prevent their escape. "We're not just running from the Hartwell family," Patricia said, her voice shaking with exhaustion and fear. "We're running from whatever they've become, and it's much larger than we ever imagined." Deep within the cave system, Chen discovered something that shattered her understanding of the entire situation. Hidden behind a rock fall that had been carefully arranged to look natural, she found a leather satchel containing documents that revealed the true scope of the Hartwell experiment. The medical journal inside was bound in cracked leather and written in multiple handwritings spanning decades. But unlike the crude family records they had seen earlier, this journal demonstrated sophisticated medical knowledge and scientific methodology that no isolated family could have developed independently. "Listen to this," Chen said, reading by the light of Rodriguez's failing flashlight. Entry dated March 15, 1923, by Dr. Marcus Krensky. The subjects continue to respond favorably to controlled exposure. Generation 3 shows significant improvement in neuroplasticity and sensory enhancement. Recommend increasing dosage of compound 7-alpha in water supply. Rodriguez studied the document over her shoulder. "Dr. Krensky, I've heard that name before. Wasn't he involved in some kind of government research project?" Chen flipped through pages that documented systematic human experimentation conducted with clinical precision. The entries described procedures for genetic modification, psychological conditioning, and chemical treatment that far exceeded anything a rural family could have devised. This was never about isolated inbreeding, she realized with dawning horror. The Hartwell family was deliberately created as a genetic experiment. Someone with advanced medical knowledge has been guiding their development for over a century. Patricia found additional documentation buried deeper in the satchel, correspondence between Dr. Krensky and government officials discussing funding, security, and the need for complete secrecy regarding the Mountain Laboratory project. "Look at these signatures," Patricia said, pointing to official letterhead. "Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, the Atomic Energy Commission." This experiment had backing from the highest levels of government. The journal revealed that the Hartwell family had been selected not randomly but specifically for their genetic markers, isolated geographical location, and psychological susceptibility to conditioning. Dr. Krensky had spent years preparing the valley for human habitation, introducing the mysterious compound to the water supply and modifying the cave systems to create controlled environmental conditions. The first generation didn't know they were test subjects. Chen read from a later entry. Marcus and Sarah Hartwell believed they had chosen isolation for religious reasons. Dr. Krensky encouraged this belief while secretly monitoring their development and that of their offspring. Rodriguez discovered maps showing the locations of similar experimental sites throughout the mountain regions of several states. Each site was marked with codes indicating different types of experiments: genetic modification, psychological conditioning, chemical exposure, radiation studies. "There are dozens of them," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Isolated communities throughout the Appalachians, all of them created as human laboratories." The documentation revealed that the experiments had been designed to test humanity's adaptability to extreme environmental conditions. The Hartwell family represented just one variation, testing genetic modification through chemical exposure and selective breeding. Other sites tested radiation resistance, psychological manipulation, and adaptation to toxic environments. They were preparing for something, Chen realized. Nuclear war, environmental collapse, something that would require humans to survive in conditions that normal genetics couldn't handle. The journal's final entries, written in Dr. Krensky's increasingly erratic handwriting, described his growing horror at what the experiments had created. The subjects are no longer human in any meaningful sense. Their genetic modifications have progressed beyond our ability to control or predict. They demonstrate capabilities that suggest evolution into something entirely new, something that views baseline humanity as an inferior species to be dominated or eliminated. Patricia found a cache of photographs documenting the progression of the experiment. Early images showed normal-appearing families, but later pictures revealed the systematic transformation into the pale, elongated beings they had encountered. The final photographs were so disturbing that Patricia couldn't look at them directly. Dr. Krensky tried to shut down the project, Chen discovered, reading the journal's last entries. He realized that the genetic modifications were becoming self-perpetuating, that the subjects were directing their own evolution in ways that hadn't been anticipated. The satchel contained one final document, a classified report dated 1953, recommending the termination of all experimental subjects and the sterilization of test sites. But the report had been stamped rejected and signed by officials whose names had been blacked out. They knew what they had created, Rodriguez said grimly. They knew it was out of control, but they decided to let it continue. Chen understood now why their investigation had been sanctioned, why they had been allowed to discover the family, despite the obvious security concerns. They weren't investigators. They were the next phase of the experiment. Test subjects being exposed to see how normal humans would react to contact with the modified population. We were never meant to leave, she said, as the sounds of pursuit grew. Closer, the helicopter that arrived 6 hours after. Rodriguez's emergency beacon activated. It carried more than just rescue personnel. Dr. Chen watched from her position in the cave. Moutha's federal agents in hazmat suits swarmed the valley, their movements coordinated with military precision that suggested this was not their first encounter with the Hartwell family agent. Sarah Morrison, no relation to the park ranger who had made the initial discovery, led a team of specialists who seemed to know exactly what they were dealing with. Their equipment included genetic scanning devices, electromagnetic field detectors, and containment units designed for transporting biological samples that might pose contamination risks. Dr. Chen, Deputy Rodriguez, Miss Wells, Agent Morrison called through a loudspeaker. You need to report for immediate medical evaluation and debriefing. Your exposure time requires Protocol 7 containment procedures. Chen realized that the rescue team's arrival had been planned long before their investigation began. The speed of response, the specialized equipment, the obvious familiarity with the situation, all of it indicated that their mission had been orchestrated from the beginning. Down in the valley, the Hartwell family had vanished. The compound stood empty, its buildings showing no signs of recent habitation despite having housed over 20 individuals just hours earlier. The family's ability to disappear completely suggested escape routes and hiding places that had been prepared over decades. They're gone, Rodriguez observed, studying the abandoned buildings through binoculars. Every single one of them, along with any evidence of their existence. But Agent Morrison's team was already collecting samples from the compound's water supply, soil, and structures. Their actions suggested they knew exactly what to look for and where to find it, indicating detailed prior knowledge of the site. This isn't a rescue, Patricia realized, watching the systematic evidence collection. This is a cover-up operation. The helicopter that evacuated them to a secure medical facility in Atlanta confirmed their suspicions. The aircraft's interior was configured for biological containment, with separate air systems and decontamination protocols that suggested the passengers were considered potential hazards. During the flight, Chen observed that her companions were showing increasing signs of the transformation they had witnessed in the Hartwell children. Patricia's skin had taken on a slight translucent quality, while Rodriguez's eyes reflected light differently than they had 3 days earlier. The medical facility they were taken to specialized in genetic disorders and experimental treatments. Chen recognized it from professional journals as a government research center that officially didn't exist, funded through black budget allocations and staffed by scientists who had signed lifetime secrecy agreements. Dr. Amanda Foster, the facility's director, greeted them with the casual familiarity of someone who had been expecting their arrival. Dr. Chen, we've been monitoring your exposure levels since you entered the valley. The genetic modifications have progressed more rapidly than we anticipated. You've been watching us the entire time, Chen accused. The Hartwell site has been under continuous surveillance for 70 years, Dr. Foster confirmed. Your investigation was authorized specifically to test interaction protocols between baseline humans and modified populations. The medical examinations revealed that all three investigators had been genetically altered by their exposure to the valley's environment. The changes were irreversible and would continue progressing regardless of treatment attempts. What happened to the family? Rodriguez demanded during his debriefing session. The Hartwell population has been relocated to a more secure facility, Agent Morrison explained. They represent valuable assets in our ongoing research into human adaptation and evolution. Chen learned that the government had been operating similar experiments at dozens of sites, each testing different variables in human genetic modification. The Hartwell family represented one of the most successful outcomes, but also one of the most dangerous. They're not human anymore, Dr. Foster admitted during a private consultation with Chen, but they're not hostile either. They've simply evolved beyond the point where normal human concerns apply to them. The official report filed 6 months later listed the investigation as inconclusive due to equipment failure and contaminated samples. Park Ranger Morrison was transferred to a different region, and the valley was redesignated as a permanent wilderness preserve with restricted access. Chen, Rodriguez, and Patricia were offered comfortable positions within the government's genetic research program. Their continued transformation monitored and documented for future reference. They were told their expertise would be valuable in managing contact with other modified populations as they emerged. The classification level assigned to their case file ensured that no information about the Hartwell family would ever reach public attention. The experiment would continue, but under more controlled conditions and with better security protocols. How many more sites are there? Chen asked during her final briefing. Enough to ensure humanity's survival when the time comes, Dr. Foster replied cryptically. Evolution doesn't always wait for permission. 6 months after the official closure of the Hartwell investigation, Dr. Chen stood in her new laboratory at the Atlanta Research Facility, studying genetic samples that defied every principle of human biology she had learned during 20 years of medical practice. Her own transformation had progressed to the point where normal humans found her appearance unsettling. But the changes had brought enhanced sensory perception and cognitive abilities that made her previous limitations seem primitive. Patricia Wells had adapted less successfully to her transformation. The psychological stress of becoming something no longer entirely human had triggered a breakdown that required constant medical supervision. She spent her days in a specialized ward, writing reports about her experiences that would never be seen outside the facility's classified archives. Rodriguez had embraced his changes with the pragmatism that characterized his law enforcement background. His enhanced physical capabilities made him valuable for field operations involving other modified populations, though he rarely spoke about the missions that took him away from the facility for weeks at a time. The Hartwell family had been relocated to a research complex deep beneath the Colorado Mountains, where they continued their evolution under controlled conditions. Chen received regular reports about their development, documenting changes that pushed the boundaries of what could still be considered human genetics. The children had grown rapidly in their new environment, reaching physical and intellectual maturity within months rather than years. Their telepathic abilities had strengthened to the point where they could communicate across vast distances, and their bodies showed adaptations that would allow survival in environments toxic to baseline humans. They're not the same species anymore, Chen wrote in her daily observations. Whatever they've become represents a branch of evolution that diverged from humanity generations ago. Communication with them requires accepting that normal human concepts of individuality, mortality, and consciousness no longer apply. Dr. Foster visited Chen's laboratory regularly, reviewing progress reports and discussing the implications of the ongoing research. The government's genetic modification program had expanded to include dozens of sites, each testing different approaches to human enhancement and adaptation. The Hartwell success has opened new possibilities, Dr. Foster explained during one of these visits. We're beginning to understand how extreme environmental pressures can guide genetic development in specific directions. Chen's own research focused on the crystalline compound found in the valley's water supply. Analysis had revealed that the substance wasn't entirely natural. It showed signs of artificial modification, suggesting that the original experimenters had introduced engineered materials to accelerate the transformation process. Someone was directing the experiment from the beginning, Chen realized. Dr. Krensky and his team weren't just observing natural genetic drift, they were actively guiding evolution toward predetermined outcomes. The facility's classified archives contained records of similar experiments dating back to the 1920s, when government scientists had first begun exploring human genetic modification as a tool for military advantage. The Hartwell family represented just one strand in a web of research that had produced dozens of modified populations throughout the American mountain regions. Chen often thought about the empty picture frame they had found in the abandoned Hartwell homestead after the family's relocation. The frame had contained no photograph, but its presence suggested that somewhere in their long isolation, the family had maintained hope for normal human connections that could never be achieved. Her final report, submitted 6 months after her transformation began, documented the complete success of the Hartwell experiment while raising questions about the ethical implications of creating new forms of human life. The subjects have achieved adaptation capabilities that exceed our most optimistic projections. They demonstrate survival traits that would allow continued existence in environments that would kill normal humans within hours. However, their psychological development has progressed beyond the point where integration with baseline human populations would be possible. The research continued in facilities hidden throughout the country, each site advancing different aspects of human modification research. Chen understood that she was witnessing the early stages of a transformation that would eventually reshape humanity itself. Late at night, alone in her laboratory, Chen sometimes wondered if the Hartwell children had been right about their evolution representing humanity's future. The world they had been created to survive, one of environmental collapse, genetic contamination and resource scarcity, seemed increasingly inevitable with each passing year. The empty frame from the abandoned homestead sat on Chen's desk as a reminder of the human connections that had been sacrificed in the name of survival. Whatever the Hartwell family had become, they had paid for their adaptation with the loss of everything that made life meaningful to normal humans. But in the darkness of her transformed existence, Chen sometimes caught glimpses of possibilities that baseline humanity could never imagine, forms of consciousness and connection that transcended individual identity, ways of existing that didn't depend on the fragile systems that supported normal human civilization. The experiment would continue, hidden in mountain valleys and underground facilities, guided by scientists who had moved beyond conventional ethics in pursuit of humanity's ultimate survival.